I woke up today and thought, 3.5 years later is the appropriate time to revisit my old SANS is a Darkner theory video. When else could I have made it? Immediately after Chapter 2 dropped? That may make sense to the average viewer, but to a big brain genius like myself, I knew that it'd be best to wait until almost all interest and engagement in Undertale content had totally evaporated before going back to that well. Just like any pro YouTuber would recommend. Strike while the iron is as cold as a snow grave, as they say. How's it going, everyone? My name is Graham, and welcome to Two Left Thumbs. I'll save you the suspense of whether or not that original theory is disproven, and say that I think the new information we have from Chapter 2 instead slides the SANS is a Darkner theory from a place of high plausibility to a more indeterminate, still rather unknowable status. That inconclusiveness is bound to excite people, and it may surprise you to hear that I don't consider that theory 100% debunked the way many have assumed. If you're willing to stick with me, we can talk through that together, and I'll attempt to weave Chapter 2 into this theory, discarding anything that no longer makes sense, then building it back up again where I can. That original theory video is still one of the most ambitious videos I've ever put together. It took a heck of a lot of research, taking all the evidence the community had collected, stripping away the things I didn't agree with, adding my own twist, distilling that down, connecting the dots, adding, subtracting, and stitching it all back together. And with the release of Chapter 2, one singular moment within the first few minutes of the game potentially shatter the entire theory. Chris retrieves everything from the storage locker, a collection of inanimate objects that, when brought back into the dark world, become living characters yet again. We even see specific examples like Rule's card and Lancer becoming a pair of playing cards in Chris's pocket when they are taken back to the homeworld. With that alone, we could infer that if SANS were a Darkner, he would not be able to walk, talk, and joke around in this overworld. At the very least, it's been confirmed that Lancer is the Jack of Spades. I was happy to see that ended up being true, even if it was far from the most ambitious prediction I put forth. That Darkner transportation by Chris seemingly undoes a lot of that theorizing, and I plan to unpack and address that in more detail later on. But first, we need to dig back into that original video. I would recommend watching that one first, because this video builds off of that one in a way where I'm mostly assuming that you have seen it, but I'll do my best to frame things in a way where this more or less stands on its own if you have some familiarity with Undertale and Deltarune. So with that in mind, I would like to attempt a quick summary here, in case you plan to skip that first video or have seen it recently enough, giving a quick refresher on the key arguments presented there. I'm about to condense about 40 minutes into just a couple, so forgive the lack of detail given for most points. 1. SANS clearly has knowledge of other worlds. When you first enter his room, you walk around in the dark, much like entering the dark world in Chapter 1 of Deltarune. Papyrus refers to SANS' room as being like a different world, and Deltarune itself is presented in a way that is much more likely to be an alternate world rather than a direct prequel or sequel to Undertale. 2. SANS has the ability to teleport through shortcuts that match those seen in Deltarune. Even his bedroom in Undertale has a door that is much like those shortcuts. 3. SANS and Papyrus are new to Snowdin, with most characters knowing very little about either of them or where they came from. 4. SANS is the only known character to not receive a redesign between the two games. Besides Frogget, although that's such a brief example that it's hard to put a lot of stock in. 5. Darkners have colored dialogue portraits, but because SANS' face is already black and white, this doesn't actually reveal to us where he is from. It is left ambiguous. 6. SANS is seemingly defeated in battle by becoming tired and fleeing, same as Darkners. In that scene, we hear a dusting sound effect off screen. But this is the sound that plays when any battle in Undertale ends, not only when a monster is killed. 7. After his battle, SANS says he's headed to Grillby's, where we specifically find him in Deltarune. 8. We have SANS' workshop and other continuous references to his scientific mind and intellectual pursuits, which all show that he knows more and is capable of more than is ever let on directly. 9. That very same lab includes his connection to "don't forget," which is a recurring phrase in the larger series with major implications, especially with how it's used in Deltarune. And 10, the most commonly argued against point that I made is that SANS bleeds, whereas monsters aren't meant to have blood at all. That argument was the most difficult to build and can't be presented here very succinctly. I feel that I disproved the very common ketchup theory in that video with about a 99% certainty. I go into excruciating detail and lay my argument out very precisely, and I still ended up with about 1,000 rebuttal comments that said nothing more than, "Nope, the blood is ketchup." Such is the nature of YouTube theorizing. Everyone is welcome to their own. I made many other smaller arguments along the way, aiming to include every bit of relevant information as well as tangential, less concrete pieces of evidence that I could in the event the theory proved to be true. That video was made using what was available at the time: Undertale and Deltarune Chapter 1. Now, before moving forward into any new lore or concepts introduced with Chapter 2, that core list of 10 first needs a ruthless re-examination. Because I put the work in to be thorough in that original video, I can still confidently stand by the majority of it. But I don't insist on being right and want to see how that evidence holds up given the new context of Chapter 2. Updating and expanding theories is about half the fun of crafting them in the first place. My goal is always to present things in a more factual, logical way and attempt to predict where the larger story is headed. I don't like to make major leaps or assumptions when I can avoid it, relying on as many small piecemeal clues as I can to prop things up. However, that leaves my theories very vulnerable to new information, so I'm more than willing to share holes in the theory now that they've been pointed out. Before we go any deeper into that, I want to quickly share the latest addition to the Two Left Thumbs indie game publishing catalog, Schism. This is an action roguelike bullet hell RPG. There is intense dungeon crawling action, loads of different stats to level up and refine your build, looter-shooter-esque gun customization, gods to worship adding further variety to your runs, the ability to switch frequencies to avoid incoming bullets, loads of secrets, crazy boss battles. This game has it all. Schism is deep, complex, and insanely replayable. There is a free demo on Steam now. We're very excited to have new people playing it to share their feedback and improve the game further. And if nothing else, please consider adding it to your wish list. This signals to Steam that people are interested in the title and gives it a little lift in their algorithm. That would help us out so much. There will be a link at the top of the description, a pinned comment. I'll remind you again at the end of the video. If you look that list of 10 points over again, none of them are actually disproven by the new information we are given in Chapter 2. Alternate worlds, shortcuts, SANS and Papyrus's residence, SANS' design, Darkner portraits, SANS fleeing battle, heading to Grillby's, SANS' workshop, don't forget, and SANS' blood. There are no additional arguments directly for or against any of them, only surrounding supplementary information that gives some of those generalized ideas a little more shape. For example, re-examining the way SANS seemingly flees the battle after becoming tired. We have now seen that Birdly, and by extrapolation monsters in general, can get tired in battle. We had never seen that before, not without the character explicitly dying or being spared by other means. But this example starts to steer towards the black swan fallacy, which is when someone discounts the possibility of something just because you've never seen it before. If you've only seen white swans your whole life, you might argue against someone who is telling you black swans exist. Your personal experience doesn't support that. Looking back to this franchise, we have been repeatedly shown that Darkners can be defeated by getting tired, but have never been shown that monsters are incapable of getting tired in battle, or that they could not be defeated by becoming tired. That possibility was never available, but neither was it ruled out. We still have not plainly seen an example where a monster is defeated by becoming tired, the way Darkners can be. So, Birdly getting tired serves as a new piece of the puzzle, how fatigue works in battles, but without actually answering how this behavior applies to or ties into the battle with SANS. This is what I mean by supplementary information giving old ideas new shape. We have new boundaries and confines to the rule set of how battles work in this franchise, without having a direct textbook that tells us precisely what can and cannot happen in every possible combination of these circumstances. There's yet another angle of the argument presented on SANS in battle that can now be re-examined, and I think this one more directly undoes the connections between Darkners, SANS, and battles. Chapter 2's Snowgrave route showed us that Darkners do not exclusively flee, and can still be killed, although their dusting appears to be different from that of monsters in Undertale. And I've actually seen people interpret that in favor of this Darkner theory, suggesting the way they first turn red is because of their blood. And while I'd love to use that as supporting evidence to hold up my old theory, I think the red flash is instead just a creative choice likely used for dramatic effect. There are heaps of these new ideas painting a larger picture of these worlds, but rarely with the explicit answers to any of these questions. However, while we're here poking holes, anyone familiar with that first video may have noted a major omission. This is something I now feel was poorly framed, even without the context of Chapter 2. SANS is also the only character in Undertale that can dodge attacks, which is something the Darkners consistently do. Monsters throughout Undertale are unable to dodge attacks. There are a few exceptions to this, but there are explanations for each. The different Amalgams and Asriel seem to be the only characters that can actually properly dodge attacks. Now, Asriel at this point is basically a god, so maybe the ability to dodge has become available to them, or more likely it follows the logic scene with the Amalgams. First off, immediately, Asgore is capable of dodging. Undyne discusses a battle she had with him. Once, to prove I was the strongest, I tried to fight Asgore. Emphasis on tried. I couldn't land a single blow on him. This gives us some additional information, but still not the whole story. This only really tells us that one monster is capable of dodging another. In Undertale, the player can see and anticipate attacks, thus dodging around them within our battle box. We've never been given a perspective that clarifies if this is a human-only trait, or something that comes up through determination. We don't actually know how attacks are perceived from a monster's perspective, whether or not they're dodging a representation of their soul around the screen same as we are, whether that be human v monster or monster v monster. And it doesn't stop there. With Sans' unique understanding of time and space, maybe he's able to manipulate things in a way that allows him to dodge human-based attacks in a way other monsters or Darkners could not. I'll admit, those arguments are based more on a lack of specific examples rather than direct evidence. So again, kind of Black Swan, but with a little less Natalie Portman. With this additional information, saying that dodging is a Darkner-only thing becomes quite flimsy. With all of this taken into consideration, it requires a few too many assumptions for my taste. Taking even more of that surrounding evidence into consideration, the idea that SANS lacking a visible HP bar as being significant, that is still quite interesting to me, but there's a further layer to it that I previously missed. The lack of an HP bar appears to be a product of this being a scripted fight, as when selecting his name in the battle UI, he also does not have an HP bar, so he never has one, whereas Darkners actually do display a health bar in the menus. Lumping that all together, characters getting tired and or fleeing from battles, the ability to dodge, and the lack of an HP bar can all be picked apart to the point that I no longer feel comfortable including that in my list of core arguments. Addressing these oversights, how SANS behaves and is interacted with in battle, has lost a lot of credibility. I'll scratch that one off of my meaningful evidence for whether SANS is indeed a Darkner. But the remaining 9 points will continue to stand as the backbone for this theory. I'll kind of lump those together. How SANS moves through the world, his arrival in Snowdin and use of shortcuts, his physical characteristics, like his unchanging design, the Darkner portraits, and his blood, and his scientific pursuits, knowledge of alternate worlds, his workshop, and the significance of Don't Forget. These 9 points all remain unaffected. So while very few of those original points have been disproven, there are still plenty of new things to look at. And the remainder of this video will instead come down to entirely new points of interest from Chapter 2 and what they potentially add or subtract from that theory. There have been new theories spinning out that Deltarune's hometown is the one true world. Everything there is based in science and reality, with much of Undertale's fantasy elements stripped away. That sounds like a world SANS would be very comfortable in, but he explicitly states he is not from here either. This hometown has no magic or crazy mythos. Citizens use ovens and computers rather than fire magic or echo flowers. Beyond its Undertale connections, the setting is familiar to us as a modern society, other than being inhabited by monsters. A theory that builds off that idea is that the entirety of Undertale is in fact a dark world as well. So in Undertale, all these characters have been pulled into a dark world, inhabiting new roles, being reinterpreted and assimilating into a world of magic. The same way Chris, Susie, Noelle, and Birdly turn into RPG fantasy trope equivalents upon entering the dark worlds of Deltarune, it could explain why these monsters can all use magic in Undertale, but not in Deltarune's hometown. I think that's a lot of fun, and is a theory that we could run away with entirely disconnected from SANS. But it doesn't fit very well here, as we would then expect SANS to look and behave differently if we were previously seeing him in a different dark world. Based on the apparent redesign rules of dark worlds we've seen, we would expect one of the two versions of SANS to look different. At a minimum, visually, but we've also seen many characters that have inverse personalities across the two games, so things don't quite add up on that front, and I'll be digging into that more a little later in the video. But questioning the dark worlds leads into the big, obvious, apparent smoking gun. I'm finally addressing the point made early on in the video, Darkner's inability to exist outside of their own world, whether that be existing in a different dark world or turning into an inanimate object in the overworld. We have direct evidence that Lancer and Rule's card turn to statues when they spend too long in the cyber dark world. The exceptions to this scene are the original Starwalker and Ralsei, and the Starwalker is such a joke of a character that I will assume we shouldn't treat them as behaving regularly. It's seemingly just this meta gag that is being milked for all it's worth, irrespective of any rules his existence might break. The Starwalker may also remain safe because he's kept in Chris's possession, just as Lancer remained safe and healthy up until he went on his own and was statuified. We don't know if that happened because Lancer went on his own or was simply a product of the time spent in that dark world. But it does seem that that effect only applies when traveling between two dark worlds. So, if SANS is a Darkner, and we assume that the hometown is not secretly also a dark world, then becoming a statue would not be a risk. As another tangent, I don't think hometown is a dark world, at least not based on what we've seen so far. But if there did end up being super subtle breadcrumbs leading to that, and the game ended with a dark worldception reveal, that would be really cool. I have to keep building these up in pieces, so I promise I will get back to the whole inanimate object aspect of this. First, I want to look at the Castle Town, which exists via the Grand Fountain, a place of pure darkness that allows Darkners from all other dark worlds to cohabitate without risk of solidifying. But it is never explicitly stated whether the inverse is true, whether beings originating from this fountain of darkness are thus granted additional abilities to persist in all other dark worlds. Ralsei is the real mystery here. He is somehow at home in either world, never turning to a statue despite spending all that time walking around in the open. Really, that just leads into more Ralsei theorizing than it does evidence for or against SANS. Is Ralsei a Darkner at all? Did Ralsei open these fountains himself so he could recruit Darkners from all over as some sort of power grab? How is he able to move himself between dark worlds without Chris's help? It at least shows us that SANS could potentially also move around without turning to stone if he learned to hop between worlds the same way Ralsei has. Which now leads into the much bigger, much more compelling piece of evidence. One that carries a few less assumptions and seemingly shatters the previous SANS is a Darkner theory. We have finally been shown that Darkners exist in the light world as inanimate objects. Chris, as a Lightner, is able to pick up and move everyone we knew from Chapter 1 by collecting the toys from the storage closet, bringing them through the light world, and dropping them back into another dark world in the Castle Town. We can even see specifically in our inventory that both Lancer and Rules are represented by transportable playing cards. However, the Starwalker is never shown in the light world at all, neither as themselves or as any sort of pocketable object. So is that already showing us that this isn't a hard and fast rule? Or again, are we not meant to treat a gag character like the Starwalker as meaningful evidence of anything? All this contradictory evidence is really pissing me off. A separate theory I really like in regards to Darkners being physical embodiments of overworld objects is that Ralsei could actually be the green crayon missing from the drawer in the very opening of Chapter 1. Maybe if it belonged to Asriel, that would explain why Ralsei inherited some of the looks and even name of that character. But we've had no other evidence that personal attachment and memories surrounding an object influence how it's presented in the dark world. I think it's a fun theory regardless, and thought it'd be worth introducing to viewers to allow them to spin out and start building on that in the comments. I'm sorry, it's just so easy to go off on separate thoughts. Back to Darkners broadly becoming objects in the light world. Speaking of many tangents, if one from my last theory video is to be believed that SANS is the Ace of Spades, then he should therefore only exist in the hometown as a playing card, not a physical, walking, talking, sentient being of any kind. Even if that Ace of Spades theory were separately debunked and SANS is not a card at all, he should still turn into a classroom skeleton, a whoopee cushion, or some other small token that represents his Darkner self. This transforming rule seems ironclad, except for the fact that Ralsei again casts this into doubt. With no known or witnessed assistance, Ralsei is able to transport himself from Castletown to the cyber world. This should only be possible if the dark worlds are adjacent up in Hometown, as was seen with the closet door in Chapter 1. The Fountain of Darkness and Eastern Fountain exist in two light world rooms that are separated by a single door. we are able to travel through that door in the dark world, even though it appears to be locked in the hometown. Now, our only Chapter 2 fountain in the library is across town. From what we've seen, there'd be no way to travel to it without first moving into the light world, turning into an object, and being brought back down to the second dark world. I see three possible explanations. One, there are shortcuts between these worlds that Ralsei has kept secret, likely ones similar to what SANS uses and what we were introduced to within the world of Chapter 1. Two, Ralsei himself is not actually a Darkner and can come and go from the worlds the same way Chris and Susie do. The most obvious explanation there would be that Ralsei is actually Asriel, or in some way a manifestation of Asriel's, but that simultaneously feels too obvious and like nonsense, since these main characters would know and recognize Asriel down here. Or three, there is a secret means through which Darkners are able to maintain a sentient corporeal form and exist outside of the dark world without the assistance of a Lightner. We haven't been shown enough to know which, if any of those, is true. It is the single thing that is most likely to fully disprove this theory other than outright giving us the answer. But because there's just enough obfuscation on how this actually functions, it still isn't concrete enough to rule it out entirely. Secret shortcuts currently feels the most likely to me for Ralsei, which would match well with what we already know about SANS. But learning to emerge into the overworld as your Darkner self is seemingly the only explanation for how SANS could exist in the hometown while being a Darkner. And we don't really have any evidence to support that. Really, it's all just piling on that Ralsei is acting increasingly suspicious and is likely to betray us and possibly even be the final boss of Deltarune. I think people are pretty split on whether Ralsei is just a cute, silly little goat boy or if he's actually a nefarious mastermind pulling the strings. I'm not sure entirely how far that will go, but I've been pretty firmly in the Ralsei is a secret villain camp since Chapter 1, and I'm sticking with that. We're also lacking an explanation for why everyone's relationships have been refracted or altered. It's easy enough to write that off and many other Deltarune theories, considering Toby has outright described that Deltarune is a different world with different characters and a new story. The events of one game do not directly affect the events of the other, so while reading into specific relationships creates fascinating parallels, it seemingly will not help us untangle any larger mysteries. Let's look directly at that quote from Toby. Deltarune's world is a different one. It doesn't specify that these worlds are disconnected or unrelated, although the ability to scramble both games' letters into unrelated is fairly damning. Very unsure how much stock to put in that. It's a recurring element in these games, mostly observed through SANS, that there are many, many worlds. Each of those are the millions of copies of the game that we all bought and played, with the potential for there to be many more beyond that. People have attempted to discount connections between these games by saying things like, SANS only says he'll go to Grillby's after a genocide run, and if Toby is saying every ending we experienced is true, then this SANS can't be the one that overlaps with anything from Undertale. But I think it's a misinterpretation to think that Deltarune is actually carrying forward from the specific events or endings of Undertale. For example, when playing Deltarune, your pacifist Undertale run isn't invalidated or wiped out of canon. It's all canon, but existing in separate worlds. Deltarune is a different world. And we know that Undertale is comprised of millions of worlds. Regardless of the chronology of these two titles, with the rising popularity of multiverse theory in film and television, it's no stretch to think we are experiencing a similar infinite range of these characters and their worlds. And SANS is the only major character who has learned to travel through time and space. It's all but confirmed he can do so in Undertale, and he's perhaps reached beyond the infinite iterations of Undertale, now spinning out into a truly infinite multiverse. If you subscribe to the idea that Deltarune must take place after Undertale, it could be that the many iterations of Deltarune all spawned from the many genocide runs of Undertale. The idea that these worlds are different, multiversal, or one coming before the other are not mutually exclusive. There are many different ways of looking at how these are arranged or situated relative to one another that never invalidate Toby's words. And that isn't necessarily the only thing that would or could have brought SANS to this point. This recurring setting simply shows us that Grillby's is a place of comfort and familiarity for SANS, and that when times get tough or he ends up somewhere new on his journeys across the universe, this is a comfort that he immediately seeks out. Whether he's new to Snowdin in Undertale or to hometown in Deltarune, losing a battle for his life or looking to meet new people, his first instinct is to seek out whatever version of his favorite haunt currently exists. This is very unlikely to be the exact same Grillby's. They share almost nothing in common whatsoever other than the name and exterior. A small but interesting connection that may support the idea of SANS' universe hopping is one simple magazine. Beyond being a Mega Man Legends reference, you can find a car magazine on the shelf in Deltarune's Grillby's, same as the one Grillby's patrons in Undertale have observed SANS reading, and the only known cars in either world belong to Deltarune. Although that doesn't really explain why these monsters would even know what a car is. The only example of a car we have in Undertale is that of Papyrus's car bed. He also shares, "If I ever get to the surface, I'd like to drive down a long highway, wind in my hair, sun on my skin." Of course, that's just a dream. But it seems unlikely that he would even know what a car is, unless it's a concept he's been introduced to by SANS. The physical connection of this magazine to Grillby's lends some credence to what may otherwise be considered a pair of throwaway gags. It could be showing us that SANS is bringing objects with him between these two worlds. Another example could be Ice-E, a character that seemingly only exists in the hometown light world. Yet SANS and Papyrus are able to present the player with an Ice-E based word search in Undertale. These objects could be showing us that SANS is bouncing around between these worlds in whatever order he chooses. And with that in mind, we can't put much stock in the ordering of things, because he clearly isn't experiencing these worlds or time in general in the same order we are. It is an entirely separate, very large debate as to whether or not Deltarune or Undertale takes place first. Deltarune Chapter 2 has beat us over the head with the fact that these monsters have not lived the same lives as in Undertale. They seem to have retained much of their core personalities, but many have vastly different hobbies, preferences, and relationships. Rather than once again meeting Undertale's literal exact cast of characters, we seem to be interacting with their reflections. Alphys is a teacher, not a scientist. Alphys and Undyne are only just now starting to know each other. This Librarby monster now hates libraries. Caddy and Braddy are instead rivals. This rabbit girl cannot lead her brother around anymore. The dog guards are now all criminals. Aaron is a quiet hipster rather than a gym bro. And on, many of them being the exact opposite of what we had seen before. Perhaps these characters are on a track of self-discovery that may be leading them from one personality observed to the next. In every example, either version of those characters we've met could be the end point of potential character arcs. Even though these monsters appear to be on this abnormal path, something we are unfamiliar with, it could come to be that certain qualities of their personality, hobbies, or relationships could prove to be inevitable. Maybe Undertale's Alphys will retire and become a teacher, or Deltarune's Alphys will seek greater knowledge and pursue a higher education to become a scientist. Are Undertale's Braddy and Caddy doomed to have a falling out, or do the pair in Deltarune need an excuse to interact and realize how much they have in common? Perhaps it is as simple as one world being the opposite of the other. The magical becomes normal, friends become enemies, heroes become criminals. Or are the two different worlds truly disconnected with no association whatsoever? Considering Toby was planning out these two games simultaneously, I find it hard to believe that he decided to discard all that planning and simply do a 180 with a few random NPCs. And furthermore, there are key, deep-seated traits that remain unchanged. Alphys is still a nervous wreck most of the time. Toriel remains incredibly kind and paternal. SANS is a wisecracking smartass who still breaks the fourth wall and looks out for and loves his brother. SANS is the character who has changed the least. This could actually tie into the lack of character redesign in a significant way. In the true pacifist credits of Undertale, we see Toriel and Asgore in their Deltarune outfits when they are no longer Queen and King. Our other two main examples are Alphys and Undyne, who both hold jobs that require a uniform or generally alternate attire. So our main main examples appear to be tied to altered circumstances, roles, and careers rather than complete reinterpretations of the characters. A few people pointed that out after Chapter 2 dropped, and I think it's super important. SANS potentially looks the same because he doesn't take his work seriously and always dresses casually. There'd be no need to change up his wardrobe, regardless of where he's originally from. I didn't include any of this as a fully formed rebuttal before, because characters like Monster Kid have seemingly changed their entire appearance for no apparent reason. And we have characters like Frogget or Onion-san who also didn't appear to change. But they didn't really have clothes to change. It's a mixed bag. But the characters that did change seem to have changed for distinct reasons that SANS is seemingly immune to. Heck, his theme music, SANS, is the only song to appear unchanged in both soundtracks. So while not changing clothes might come down to a conscious choice from SANS, the unaltered music attached to him appears to reach beyond a character choice and could instead be an example of his immunity to the world-changing meta. That music could be our most concrete piece of evidence that the two SANSes are not reflections of each other, but are the exact same character hopping between worlds. It tells us nothing about what or who SANS actually is, but it does seemingly shrink these two characters down into one, just in case anyone was still debating that point. SANS also still appears to know he is in a game, and is the only one in the light world who does. Combine that with his final boss status in Undertale, apparent connections to Gaster, presented in much more detail in my Pieces of Gaster videos, and SANS starts to feel more closely connected to characters like Jevil and Spampton than to any other monster. Really, he seems to be more connected to us, the human character, than he is the monsters. That could explain a heck of a lot, including being a literal skeleton and having blood, but that would be a whole nother jar of worms to open. I'll choose to set that one aside atop my growing list of spun-off theories. Keep an eye out for SANS is a human gamer coming 2027. When adding together the new information presented in Chapter 2, things aren't looking good for the SANS is a Darkner theory. Yet I wouldn't say it's been definitively debunked, with plenty of room left open to explain away these lingering questions. It just wouldn't take much at this point to close off that theory for good. It'll really depend on what exactly the worlds of Deltarune and Undertale are, and whether that is ever explained. I think it can be commonly accepted that the idea of SANS is SANS still holds true, that these two characters are one and the same. One being who has literally traveled between these many worlds and games. Whether he is a monster, Lightner, Darkner, or something else entirely remains to be seen. The point of this video was never to discount all the naysayers and to claim that I'm right, but to simply offer up that nothing has truly been ruled out yet. And that leaves me so damn excited for what comes next. This last stretch of the video doesn't actually present any new evidence. It instead reflects on theorizing as a whole and how I view my own role within this community. If that's of no interest to you, then now would be a perfect time to follow up on Schism, go add that to your wish list, put some hours into the demo, and let us know what you think. Otherwise, stick around, and I think there's some more interesting discussions to be had in the latter part of this video. While this video had been asked for many times, I wasn't sure I would ever make a part 2. But it's now been brought to my attention that my original theory video still gets circulated and often talked about as if it were some ironclad factual thing that you either had to be for or against. To me, that's the least interesting way to treat theorizing. I don't want to force people to have to choose a singular camp to believe in. I don't think I'm fully convinced one way or the other myself. I'd rather remain open to all possibilities until undeniably proven otherwise. Theorizing is about pooling together information, our collective understanding of those ideas, and tracing connections between them to interpret limited data. Making that original video, I was working with one full game and, at most, 1/7 of a second. I knew that it would only take a whisper of wind from Chapter 2's release to make that house of cards come crashing down. But it was still fun to try and map out and extrapolate the extremely limited information we were presented, much of which was probably never intended to inform anything at all. Then weaving it together with facts from the franchise to try and craft something coherent, but the end result was only ever meant to be an interpretation, with my fingers crossed that I got a few things right, not some gospel of truth. That's not to absolve myself of any criticism. If I'm insanely off base, have been sloppy with my connections, omitted a detail, misinterpreted something, or simply failed to communicate my point effectively, then I absolutely expect people to call me out on that and provide their rebuttals. Those discussions often lead to amazing discoveries or brand new theories. There's a reason I always offer up tangential theories in these videos. It's really hard not to start analyzing everything once you start picking away at it. And because it's fun to let others run wild with the seed of an idea and see if it holds up to any real stress testing. But those debates shouldn't place you against me or against anyone else. Crafting strong theories is sort of a game of its own, not a competition. Think of it as cooperative multiplayer. Rather than tearing each other down, I think it should be treated as something additive, and maybe collectively we can end up relatively close to the truth. Way back when, I waited to make my Binding of Isaac theory video until all the games were available. Bumbo, Four Souls, Repentance, hoping all of those sources would improve my odds of being accurate. I poured my heart into that video, apparently got quite a few things right, but definitely still missed some key details. And that's okay. I think I basically would have had to have stalked Ed McMillan to fit in any more specificity into that theory than I already did. Looking again to my Undertale videos, I've seen the odd viewer cherry pick ideas I presented and start running them around the community as fact. My other Undertale videos, like the Spamton Sweepstakes summary or the entire Gaster Eggs series that documents, references, Easter eggs, and missable details from these games, any of those are often about 95% me presenting direct facts and details from those games, and about 5% just spitballing connections that I observe while playing. I thought it would be clear to people when I'm just throwing something out there versus specifically researching it, but even those loosely formed thoughts and musings get quoted as irrefutable theories. Unless it's a dedicated theory video, I probably haven't researched it all that thoroughly, and I'm just leaning on my own knowledge of the series to spark some conversations. I want to offer up those ideas so others can run with them, build off of it, maybe disprove it, or make it their own in some way. I didn't come up with the theory that SANS is a Darkner. That's something I had seen here or there, and I decided to hold it up to my own flame to see if anything ignited. I think I've pitched some unique and interesting things over the years in those videos, and maybe someday it would be a fun video idea to single those out and attempt to research and build off of my own off-the-cuff theories. Otherwise, I'm just trying to document, summarize, and otherwise organize interesting details about these games. I don't venture outside my own theorizing bubble too often, so I hope there haven't been years worth of people misinterpreting the intent of those videos. And for anyone who loves meaty, detailed theorizing, I'd recommend checking out any of the members of the Delta Cast. That is a collective of people in this fandom who are often much more theory-oriented than myself, putting together deeply analytical videos. And even within this group of Undertale theorists, they'll joke that they can never do scripted collabs together because it's impossible for everyone to agree on individual points. Every theory is going to be filtered through the individual. We all have our own biases and interpretation that will lead to a personalized perspective, shaping that same pile of information into totally separate explanations. And again, that's okay. I'd like to think the few theories I've done hold up, at least at the time of their release, and if they have aged poorly, they can act as a time capsule based on the information that was available at the time. The perfect example of that has become that SANS is a Darkner theory video, something that made a lot of sense at the time, and maybe doesn't hold quite as much water after Chapter 2 dropped. In fact, it felt so thoroughly disproven that it never felt worth making this sequel video, because I thought it would be 30 seconds of me saying, whoops, I guess I was entirely wrong. But revisiting that theory through the lens of this expanded lore felt like a great opportunity to address the fandom, talk about what I do, share my thoughts on theory crafting, and then punch a hole straight through what apparently has come to be a rather contentious video. And the process ended up being a lot of fun for me, and I'm kinda surprised how well it does hold up. I still think there's something odd going on with SANS, and I very much hope we get to learn more about that, but it's seeming less likely that he's a Darkner. Thank you so much for listening to me ramble about games for all these years. I have no idea when the rest of Deltarune is going to drop, but I have my fingers crossed I can play a bit of catch up here. I have a few other ideas for videos about this series that I'm hoping to tackle. I guess we'll see what I'm able to get done before then, because there is a remote possibility it still releases in 2023, potentially on one of those two important anniversaries that Toby so often makes use of. I'm not sure how many people who saw the original video will have found their way to this sequel, but whether you did or didn't like that original one, I hope you found something to enjoy about this process. So thank you all yet again. Thank you to patrons of the channel for their support. Thank you once again, Fruz, for editing this video. I doubt I'd ever finish it otherwise. I look forward to seeing how you all build off of this discussion, and I hope to see you all again soon.